Welcome to Street Biashara, where we test your general knowledge on business terms. Now you can see I'm back on the streets of Nairobi. I'm about to find out what Kenyans understand with the term liability. Do you know what it means? Well, let's go find out.
Liability inamaanisha ile kitu ambayo inafanya biashara inapoteza pesa. Inaweza kuwa ni deni, inaweza kuwa ni hasara fulani, ama inaweza kuwa pengine ni ile expenses yenye biashara inarago. Hiyo tunaweza tukasema ni liability. Kwa mfano kama unanunua mafuta ya gari kwa biashara, hiyo gari ama hiyo mapesa mafuta ni kama liability kwa biashara yako.
Liability, I can say this is a kind of an asset.
Expenses. Expenses that the business has to meet. And in most cases it can be, let me say, things like loans. I guess I can't give the actual definition, but that's what I understand from it.
Liability is something like a loss. Mostly liabilities, these are losses that people incur.
Liabilities, that's from the word liability, it means it's a burden. It is an expense that you incur after you spend. So it might not be necessarily be an asset, but it's a burden that is incurred by a certain either an individual or account.
Liabilities ni inahusika ile vitu ambayo unahacha navyo sana. First come in your the first needs in your business.
Now, after getting the chance to really understand what Kenyans know about the term liability, we're back in studio and it's time for us to get a clear perspective from an expert. Now, joining me today on this episode of Street Biashara is Job Kiage, who is an accounting and finance expert. Thank you so much for joining me today, Job.
Thank you very much. It's always a pleasure.
Great. So we'll just jump right into you breaking it down for us what exactly liability means.
Liability is a business obligation, and these obligations are always due. So in essence, I want to shorten it. A liability is a business obligation, just straight to the point.
Okay. And I feel like this is a term we hear a lot, but if you ask someone, give me an example of liability, they'll have no idea. So can you break down for us and give us some of the examples we could consider as a liability?
Our liabilities are classified into two. We have the current liabilities and the non-current liabilities. The current liabilities are typically settled using the current assets, which are assets that are used up within 1 year, a duration of 1 year. So we are talking about the current liabilities being those liabilities which must be honored before the end of the year. An example of a current liability include the accounts payable, the short-term debts, the dividends, the notes payable, as well as the income tax owed. Those are the examples of liabilities that we have. On the other hand, we have what we call the non-current liabilities. The non-current liabilities, on the other hand, are long-term debts, long-term obligations, which must be honored at least in not less than 1 year.
Okay. Thank you so much.
An example is long-term loans.
All right. Great.
Yes.
And having talked about and explained to us what exactly liabilities are, one will just understand that it's a bad thing. A liability is not exactly good. But is there a good and bad liability?
And necessarily, liabilities are not bad. When a liability is tied into the creation of more wealth, that liability is not bad. For instance, we are talking about loans. The thumb rule is you borrow in order for you to invest. If you're doing that, a liability is not bad. But if you are having more liabilities in a business, then at the end of the duration or the financial duration, your finances in that business are going to be hurt. So it depends whether you have a huge liability vis-a-vis what that liability is doing. If that liability is being used to generate more wealth, then that liability is not bad.
And can debt or credit be classified as a liability?
Sorry?
Can debt or debt and credit, or debt or credit, be classified as a liability or not necessarily?
So when we are talking about debt, let's talk about the differences. There are primarily differences between liability and debt.
Okay.
Liability is a wider term which includes all the money or the financial obligations which a company owes to other parties. And when I'm talking about a company, I'm also including the businesses, small businesses. Whereas debt is the narrow term and is a part of the liability which rises when funds are raised by a company through borrowing or any other parties. So when we are talking about debt and liabilities, there is that distinction.
Thank you for that, Job. Now, that wraps up our conversation for today. Thank you so much for giving us a clear perspective about what liability is. I do hope our viewers now understand the term very well. Now, that brings us to the end of this episode of Street BHR. But remember, in order to learn more business terms, do join me on the next episode.